In the autumn of 1940, the dominant economic belief within the Third Reich was one of absolute proven superiority. The stunning, rapid victories in Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and finally France were seen not just as triumphs of military doctrine, but as the ultimate validation of their entire economic system. German planners, economists, and senior military figures looked at the performance of the Wehrmacht, fueled by an industry tuned for sharp, decisive campaigns, and concluded they had solved the riddle of modern warfare. They believed they had created a perfect synthesis of strategy and production, a system that harnessed the full power of a centralized state, while their degenerate foes wallowed in inefficient, chaotic capitalism. The war, they were convinced, would be a series of short, brutal sprints, not a marathon of attrition. In this new global conflict, victory would not be decided by tactical genius alone, but by the relentless mathematics of production. Now, let us return to the halls of power in Berlin, in the intoxicating atmosphere of 1940. The celebrations in Berlin were not just for the soldiers returning from the triumphant march through Paris. They were for the architects of the German war economy. Men like Fritz Todt, the Reich's Minister for Armaments and Munitions, saw the Blitzkrieg as a logistical masterpiece. The model was built on the concept of Rüstung in der Breite, or armament in width, rather than armament in depth. This doctrine meant the economy was optimized to produce a wide array of weapons needed for the next campaign, right now. It did not waste time, resources, or factory space building up the massive, deep industrial infrastructure required for a protected, years-long global conflict. Why would it? The war in France was over in 6 weeks. The French army, considered by many to be the finest in Europe, had been shattered. The British had been humiliatingly ejected from the continent at Dunkirk. This rapid success seemed to confirm every assumption. The German system was fast, flexible, and overwhelming. It avoided the exact mistake that had doomed the Kaiser's Germany in 1918, a slow, grinding war of blockade and attrition that bled the home front dry and caused its eventual collapse. The new Reich would not be starved into submission, it would simply conquer its resources. The factories of Czechoslovakia, particularly the highly efficient Skoda works, had been absorbed without a fight. The industrial basins of France and Belgium were now under German control. Their resources, materials, and even their labor fed directly into the Nazi war machine. The oil fields of Romania were secured. This strategy of systematic plunder created a powerful illusion of self-sufficiency. The German economy was not just producing, it was consuming Europe and growing stronger with each victim. In the corridors of the Reich Ministry of Economics, planners looked at their ledgers with profound satisfaction. Aircraft production, while not astronomical, was perfectly sufficient to maintain air superiority over a localized battlefield. Tank production, centered on the excellent Panzer III and I-Fu, was enough to equip the armored spearheads that had just torn the Allies apart. The system worked. It was efficient. It delivered exactly what the generals needed, precisely when they needed it. This confidence bred a dangerous intellectual arrogance. When German planners looked west, across the Atlantic, they saw a nation they believed was fundamentally broken. America, in their analysis, was a cautionary tale. It was a decadent, chaotic, consumer-driven society still hopelessly mired in the Great Depression. Its people were soft, divided by political infighting, and isolated by a naive belief that oceans could protect them. Its industry, while large, was seen as undisciplined, focused on frivolous things like automobiles, refrigerators, and radios, not the hard necessities of war. They believed American capitalism, with its competing interests, labor unions, and democratic processes, was structurally incapable of the kinds of swift, unified action that defined the Third Reich. America, they concluded, was a sleeping giant, but one so deeply drugged by its own comforts that it could never be roused in time. This assessment, born from a place of supreme self-assurance, would prove to be the single most catastrophic miscalculation of the entire war. The fatal flaw in the Third Reich's economic worldview was not a lack of intelligence, but an abundance of ideology. Their underestimation of the United States was profound, systemic, and rooted in the very core of their National Socialist doctrine. When Nazi economists looked across the Atlantic, they did not see the world's largest industrial power. They saw a decadent, disorderly, and racially mongrelized society that had grown fat and weak on consumer comforts. They saw a nation that built millions of civilian automobiles, washing machines, and vacuum cleaners, and they interpreted this as a sign of terminal softness. It was, in their view, a culture obsessed with frivolous luxuries, lacking the Spartan discipline and martial will that defined their own New Germany. This contempt was reinforced by their own recent history. They saw the bitter political debates in the American Congress and the loud, dissenting voices in the American press as evidence of crippling disunity. Their own system had silenced all dissent, unified the nation under one will, and demonstrated its efficiency with the Blitzkrieg. America, by contrast, seemed to be a chaotic mess of competing interests. They read reports of labor strikes, of intense political arguments between isolationists and interventionists, and concluded that this was a nation incapable of the unified, singular effort required for total war. How could a country that could not even agree on its own internal politics possibly muster the will to fight a global conflict thousands of miles from its shores? This political analysis was deeply interwoven with their racial theories. The Nazi leadership, from Hitler down, genuinely believed that America's strength was fatally diluted by its jumble of races. They saw it as a nation of immigrants, lacking the supposed purity and inherent strength of their Aryan Volk. This racial arrogance made it impossible for them to conceive that such a diverse population could unite under a common cause. They believed this mongrel society was inherently unstable, prone to collapse under the first real pressure. It was a house of cards, and the German war machine was the iron fist ready to topple it. Their economic analysis of the Great Depression further colored this perception. German planners had witnessed their own nation's miraculous recovery from economic collapse, achieved through massive public works and military rearmament under a totalitarian state. They looked at America, still struggling with high unemployment and the lingering scars of the 1930s, and saw only failure. They saw a capitalist system that had broken down, proving its inferiority. They completely failed to understand the latent power within that system. They saw unemployed men in breadlines. They did not see a vast, skilled, and available workforce. They saw idle factories. They did not see a massive industrial infrastructure that had merely been paused, waiting for a catalyst. Even the early warning signs, like President Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy speech in late 1940, were fundamentally misinterpreted. The German leadership heard these words not as a declaration of intent, but as a hollow boast. They saw the Lend-Lease Act of 1941 as a desperate attempt by a Jewish-controlled Washington to profit from the war, a cynical business transaction from a nation too cowardly to fight its own battles. They believed America was content to fight to the last Englishman. The idea that this was the first step in a genuine, full-scale mobilization seemed absurd. This entire framework of flawed analysis was compounded by geography. The vastness of the Atlantic Ocean provided a powerful psychological buffer. German military planners, while confident in their U-boat fleet's ability to harass shipping, deemed the logistical challenge of transporting and supplying a multi-million-man army from North America to Europe to be nearly insurmountable. Even if America could build an army, they believed, it could never be brought to bear on the decisive battlefields of Europe. The war, they were certain, would be won or lost long before the first significant American forces could ever arrive. Their calculations were based on a short, sharp war in Europe. America was a distant problem for a later date, if it was a problem at all. This combination of ideological blindness, racial arrogance, and profound misunderstanding of American industrial potential created a comforting but entirely false reality for the Nazi leadership. It was a blindness that would soon be shattered by an avalanche of steel. The German assessment of a sleeping giant was correct in one crucial respect. It was indeed a giant. What their ideological filters prevented them from seeing was the speed at which it could be awakened. The catalyst was not a slow political realization, but the sudden violent shock of Pearl Harbor. The attack on December 7, 1941, did not shatter American morale, as its planners in Tokyo had hoped and their allies in Berlin had assumed. It unified a diverse and argumentative nation of 130 million people with a singular, ferocious purpose. The bitter political divisions between isolationists and interventionists, which Nazi analysts had mistaken for terminal weakness, evaporated in a single morning. The chaotic consumer-driven economy that they had held in such contempt did not collapse under the strain of war. It pivoted. This pivot was the single greatest industrial transformation in human history. It was not a gradual retooling. It was a violent, full-stop conversion of the world's largest manufacturing base. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had laid down the challenge months earlier, calling for production numbers that sounded like pure fantasy to his adversaries. 60,000 airplanes in the first year, 125,000 in the second, 120,000 tanks, 8 million tons of shipping. To the German High Command, these figures were the delusional boasts of a democratic politician, utterly disconnected from industrial reality. To American industrialists, they were simply a new set of production targets. The man Roosevelt tapped to orchestrate this miracle was not a general or a politician, but a Danish immigrant named William Big Bill Knudsen. Knudsen was the president of General Motors, a man who lived and breathed the rhythm of the assembly line. He understood mass production at a level few men on Earth could comprehend. Pulled from the private sector, he was made chairman of the Office of Production Management. His job was simple in concept, but staggering in scope: to stop the production of civilian America and redirect that colossal energy toward war. He began with the heart of American manufacturing, Detroit. The automobile industry was the exemplar of the consumerism the Nazis despised. Within weeks of the attack, the last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly lines. The order was given: convert. The sprawling, efficient plants of Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, factories that had churned out millions of family sedans, coupes, and farm trucks, went silent. They were immediately gutted. Entire assembly lines representing billions of dollars of capital investment in the tools of peace were torn out, scrapped, or crated up. At Ford's enormous Willow Run plant in Michigan, a facility so vast it had its own airfield and was designed to build cars, the company set out to build B-24 Liberator heavy bombers. Military traditionalists were appalled. Aircraft, they argued, were complex, almost handcrafted machines, not automobiles. They required skilled artisans, careful fitting, and delicate work. Ford and his ruthless production chief, Charles Sorensen, ignored them. They would build bombers just as they had built the Model A, on a moving assembly line. The plant struggled at first, a chaotic mess of inexperienced workers and unprecedented supply chain problems. But then, the system clicked. By 1944, a fully completed B-24 bomber was rolling off the 1-mile-long assembly line every 63 minutes. A single factory was outproducing the entire German aircraft industry's output of 4-engine bombers. This same story was repeated across the nation. The Chrysler Corporation, which had specialized in building Plymouths and DeSotos, was given the task of building tanks. At the new Detroit Arsenal tank plant, engineers applied the logic they knew. They did not just build tanks, they mass-produced them. Hulls and frames moved down a line, with engines, turrets, cannons, and tracks installed at precise timed stations. On the West Coast, another titan emerged. Henry J. Kaiser had built dams and bridges. He had never built a ship. He looked at traditional shipbuilding, where a vessel was slowly built from the keel up in a static slipway over many months, and saw only inefficiency. He applied the principles of modular construction. His new shipyards, which seemed to spring up from the mud overnight, were not shipyards. They were massive outdoor assembly plants. His workers, many of them women who had never held a welding torch before, built massive sections of a ship, the bow, the stern, the deckhouse, in different areas of the yard simultaneously. Enormous gantry cranes then lifted these 200-ton prefabricated modules and lowered them into place for final welding. The first Liberty ship, the Patrick Henry, took 244 days to build. 18 months later, Kaiser's yards were averaging 42 days per ship. In a famous 1942 publicity demonstration, the Richmond yard assembled the 10-500-ton Robert E. Peary from keel laying to launch in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. This was the avalanche. America was not just building weapons, it was manufacturing them. The nation's soft consumer economy was, in fact, its greatest hidden strength. The same engineers who had designed streamlined refrigerators were now designing fighter plane components. The same managers who had organized supply chains for department stores were now coordinating the flow of steel plate and aluminum. And the same workforce that had assembled radios was now riveting the hulls of destroyers. The giant was awake. The first tremors of this industrial earthquake were not felt in Berlin's economic ministries. They were felt by the Lanzer, the German frontline soldier, in the dust of North Africa and the frozen mud of the Eastern Front. These were veteran troops, hardened by victorious campaigns, supremely confident in their training, their leadership, and their equipment. They had been told, and they believed, that they were materially superior. This belief began to crack in late 1942, and it shattered completely in 1943. In Tunisia, the men of the Africa Corps had long prided themselves on their ability to do more with less. They were masters of improvisation, fighting a clever mobile war against British forces, who often had more, but less capably used equipment. Then the Americans landed with Operation Torch. The initial encounters were not a shock. The inexperienced American troops were bloodied at Kasserine Pass, confirming German notions of their softness. But the veterans noticed something unsettling. When they destroyed an American tank platoon, more tanks appeared the next day. When they shot down a flight of aircraft, the skies were full again within hours. A German panzer commander, after a successful ambush, might count his remaining precious shells. His American counterpart, after a defeat, would simply requisition an entirely new tank, delivered from an ordnance depot overflowing with crated replacements. The German reports sent back from Tunisia began to change in tone. They were no longer just about battlefield maneuvers. They were panicked logistical tallies. Commanders requested replacements for their Panzer IIIs and short-barreled Panzer IVs, only to be told that none were available. At the same time, they faced a new American tank, the M4 Sherman. While German tankers might initially scoff at its high profile, they could not scoff at its numbers. They came in waves, supported by endless columns of trucks, jeeps, and self-propelled artillery pieces. The Wehrmacht was a powerful fighting force, but it was an army that, even in 1942, still relied heavily on horses. Hundreds of thousands of them were used to pull artillery and supply wagons, especially on the Eastern Front. The American army, by contrast, was fully mechanized. Every artillery piece was towed by a truck. Every infantry regiment had its own fleet of vehicles. The Red Ball Express in France was still a year away, but the principle was already visible in Africa. This was an army that ran on gasoline, not oats. On the Eastern Front, the scale was even more terrifying. Through the Lend-Lease program, the Soviet Union was receiving a flood of American material. German soldiers, already bleeding to death in the meat grinder of Stalingrad, found themselves facing new, unfamiliar foes. They saw American-made light tanks, sturdy Studebaker trucks that allowed the Red Army to move supplies, and Katyusha rocket launchers with terrifying speed over rough terrain, and P-39 Airacobra fighter planes that were devastatingly effective in low-altitude combat. For the German soldier, this was a profound psychological blow. He had been taught that he was fighting a decadent, weak-willed capitalist foe and a primitive, subhuman Bolshevik horde. Yet, the primitive horde was now being supplied by an endless river of high-quality trucks, tanks, and canned food from the decadent capitalist power. His own supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. A German infantryman might march for days on worn-out boots, his meals meager, while he watched captured Soviet troops being transported in brand-new American trucks, eating American rations. In Berlin, these reports were met with disbelief. The High Command, OKW, and the economic planners simply could not reconcile the battlefield data with their own production spreadsheets. When a panzer general in Tunisia reported being overwhelmed by a sea of Shermans, the analysts in Berlin checked their intelligence estimates. Their projections, based on their flawed 1941 analysis, showed that America could not be producing tanks at such a rate. Therefore, the general must be exaggerating. He was making excuses for his own tactical failure, but the reports kept coming. From U-boat commanders in the Atlantic, the new complaint was not just about the number of destroyers, but the sudden appearance of small, cheap escort carriers, merchant ships with flight decks, appearing faster than they could be sunk. From Luftwaffe pilots, the reports were of new, long-range American fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang, that were suddenly escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The industrial reality of America was no longer a theoretical debate for economists. It was a physical, lethal presence on every front. The trickle of panicked reports was becoming a flood, and in Berlin, a few men were finally beginning to listen. By early 1942, the panicked reports from the front lines could no longer be dismissed as the exaggerations of failed generals. The industrial avalanche was building, and its tremors were shaking the highest echelons of the Third Reich. In February, Armaments Minister Fritz Todt, the man who had built the Autobahns and the Siegfried Line, died in a mysterious plane crash. His replacement was a young, ambitious architect who had become Hitler's logistical favorite, Albert Speer. Speer was not a traditional economist or a career industrialist. He was a brilliant organizer, a technocrat who saw Germany's war effort not through the blurry lens of ideology, but as a vast, complex architectural project. He was given a clear mandate: rationalize the chaotic, competing factions of German industry and maximize production at all costs. And for a time, he succeeded brilliantly. He centralized authority, stripping power from the competing branches of the Wehrmacht, each of which had been running its own private industrial empires. He forced standardization of components, eliminated wasteful or redundant projects, and applied principles of mass production to factories that had previously operated like craft workshops. The results were immediate and impressive. In 1942 and 1943, German production of tanks, aircraft, and munitions soared. The new Panzer V Panther and the formidable Tiger tank began to appear. Fighter production increased dramatically. This surge created a dangerous internal illusion of success. It felt as if Germany was finally hitting its stride, closing the gap and creating the miracle weapons that would turn the tide. But Speer was one of the few men in the Reich who had access to all the data. He was not just looking at his own rising production charts. He was methodically gathering the fragments of Allied intelligence, studying reconnaissance photos of American factories, and analyzing shipping tonnage reports. He began to compile a second set of ledgers. These were not the optimistic charts he showed to Hitler to secure his own power. These were his private, horrifying calculations. Speer, the clear-eyed technocrat, began to compare his own numbers, the absolute peak of what a fully mobilized, centralized German-European economy could produce, against the numbers his intelligence services were reporting from a single, distant nation. The comparison was not just unfavorable, it was nonsensical. It defied all rational analysis. In a stark 1943 memorandum, he laid out the cold mathematics. He looked at steel. Germany, even after conquering the industrial basins of Europe, was straining to produce 30 million tons a year. America, from its decadent and inefficient capitalist base, had produced nearly 80 million tons the previous year and was on track to exceed that. He looked at aluminum, the lifeblood of an air force. German production was capped by its limited access to bauxite and its strained electrical grid. American aluminum production, powered by massive new hydroelectric projects like the Grand Coulee Dam, was already double Germany's and rising exponentially. He looked at aviation. His new rationalized system was struggling to produce 15,000 fighter aircraft a year. America, in that same period, was building over 47,000. And then he saw the numbers for heavy bombers, the very weapon that was beginning to dismantle his own factories. Germany produced almost none. America was building them at a rate of thousands per month. This was Speer's terrifying calculation. It was not a possibility of defeat. It was a statistical certainty. He realized that his own production miracle was a fallacy. He was squeezing the last drops of water from a canteen while his opponent was tapping into an ocean. The frontline reports from Tunisia and the Eastern Front were not excuses. They were simple, factual observations of this new reality. The Sea of Shermans was not a general's metaphor. It was the physical manifestation of America's 1942 output of nearly 25,000 M4 tanks, a number greater than the entire German tank force. When Speer presented these figures, or even the heavily softened versions of them, to the Nazi inner circle, he was met with blank incomprehension, denial, and rage. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, whose own prestige was tied to the dominance of the German Air Force, dismissed the American numbers as crude Allied propaganda, impossible boasts from a nation of liars. Other leaders, steeped in the doctrine of will, insisted that the superior spirit and racial quality of the German soldier would always defeat the racially inferior American, regardless of the material imbalance. Hitler himself simply waved the numbers away. He placed his faith in a different kind of mathematics, the power of revolutionary will and the promise of wonder weapons that would render conventional production obsolete. Speer, the architect, the man of numbers and physical limits, saw the truth. He was no longer a minister of armaments. He was the chief liquidator of a doomed enterprise. His job was now to manage the inevitable collapse, to perform an administrative miracle simply to keep the war going for another month, another year, while the leadership of the Reich retreated deeper into a fantasy world that the numbers had already proven false. Faced with the undeniable mathematics of Albert Speer's ledgers, the leadership of the Third Reich found itself at a terrifying crossroads. The cold, hard data proved that the war of material, the war of attrition that they had sought to avoid in 1939, was now upon them, and they were losing it. They could not produce more tanks than Detroit. They could not build more bombers than Willow Run. They could not launch more ships than Kaiser's assembly yards. For a leadership structure built on the myth of its own invincibility and the power of revolutionary will, this reality was not just strategically challenging, it was ideologically unacceptable. Their response was not to seek peace or to husband their resources for a long defense. It was to reject the rules of the game. If they could not win the war of quantity, they would leapfrog their enemy with a war of quality. They would create weapons so technologically advanced, so devastating in their power, that they would render America's industrial avalanche obsolete. This was the birth of the Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapons. It was a desperate strategic pivot, a turn from the grim reality of the factory floor to the seductive fantasy of the secret laboratory. This pivot was a gamble of colossal proportions, and it began to consume the very resources Germany needed to survive. The most infamous of these projects were the vengeance weapons. The V-2 rocket, developed at the massive secretive Peenemünde complex, was a technological marvel without precedent. It was the world's first long-range ballistic missile, a 46-foot-tall harbinger of a new age of warfare. It required an army of scientists and engineers, vast factories built underground to protect them from bombing, and exotic complex components like high-flow turbopumps and precision gyroscopic guidance systems. But the V-2 was an industrial black hole. Its fuel was a mixture of liquid oxygen and a solution of 75% ethyl alcohol, the alcohol for which was distilled from millions of tons of potatoes. This was a direct diversion of a critical food staple from the German home front. The resources poured into this one project were staggering. The skilled labor, the advanced electronics, and the tons of precious steel and aluminum consumed by the V-2 program were all desperately needed elsewhere. They were needed for the Messerschmitt fighters trying to stop the Allied bomber streams, for the U-boats being hunted to extinction in the Atlantic, and for the Panther tanks being chewed up on the Eastern Front. And the V-2's strategic impact was, in military terms, almost zero. It was a terror weapon designed to sow panic in London and, later, Antwerp. But it was wildly inaccurate. It could hit a city, but not a factory, a port, or a command center. It killed thousands of civilians, but it did not stop a single Sherman tank from being unloaded in Normandy. It did not destroy a single B-17 on its airfield. It was, in effect, the single most expensive and complex artillery shell ever built, and it was being fired blindly at the enemy's homeland in an act of pure, frustrated rage. The same fallacy applied to the skies. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was another genuine technological miracle. It was the world's first operational jet fighter, a sleek, arrow-like machine that was over 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang, the Allies' best piston engine fighter. Allied pilots who survived an encounter with one were left shaken, reporting a bat out of hell that moved with no visible propeller. But this revolutionary aircraft was a logistical nightmare. Its Jumo 004 jet engines were temperamental, prone to flameouts, and had a service life of barely 25 hours of flight. They required rare alloys like chromium and nickel, which Germany had almost run out of. The production process was immensely complex, demanding a level of metallurgical skill and precision that was simply incompatible with the realities of a collapsing bomb-shattered industrial base. Furthermore, Hitler himself, obsessed with vengeance, intervened and demanded this pure interceptor be redesigned as a blitz bomber, a high-speed fighter bomber. This diversion wasted precious months of development and production time, keeping the decisive new weapon off the front lines when it might have just possibly made a difference in the air war over Germany. While Germany's finest engineers and scarce resources were being poured into the Me-262, the Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt factories were struggling to produce the reliable, proven Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters. These were the very planes needed by the hundreds, by the thousands, to engage the Allied bomber formations. The Reich's war economy was now cannibalizing itself. It was starving its essential conventional war machine of men, fuel, and steel to feed its fantastical, resource-hungry miracle weapons. This was the ultimate fallacy. In their desperate attempt to find a shortcut to victory, they were actively accelerating their own defeat. If the wonder weapons were Germany's desperate fantasy, the 6th of June, 1944, was the Allies' brutal reality. D-Day was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a logistical event, the physical delivery of an entire industrial nation onto a hostile shore. It was the final, horrifying, undeniable proof of everything Albert Speer had calculated and everything the Nazi leadership had chosen to ignore. For the German defenders in the concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, the morning began in a state of surreal confusion. The reports of paratroopers in the dark had been dismissed as diversions. The massive naval bombardment that began at dawn was terrifying, but expected. But then, as the smoke cleared and the sun rose over the English Channel, they saw it. It was not a fleet. It was a city of steel that had materialized from the fog. Nearly 7,000 vessels of every conceivable size blotted out the horizon. There were battleships and destroyers, cruisers and landing craft, but most terrifying of all were the transports, the endless forest of cargo ships, tankers, and repurposed merchant vessels that stretched back line after line to the horizon. A German machine gunner peering from his pillbox on Omaha Beach could follow his training. He could aim, fire, and inflict terrible casualties on the first waves of American infantry. He could watch landing craft founder. But it did not matter. For every man who fell, 10 more took his place. For every landing craft hit by artillery, 20 more ground themselves onto the sand. And behind them came the machines. Waterproofed M4 Sherman tanks, some swimming ashore under their own power, crawled out of the surf and began to blast the German emplacements. Bulldozers, delivered in the first few hours, began plowing paths through the obstacles. Trucks, jeeps, and half-tracks rolled off the larger landing ship tank vessels and began to form orderly columns on the beach, often while still under fire. The German planners had built a wall to stop an army. The Allies simply brought a moving factory that began to disassemble it. But the true scale of the industrial disparity was not revealed on the beaches, but in the days that followed. The German High Command, including Field Marshal Rommel, had based their entire defensive strategy on a single critical assumption. The Allies must capture a deep-water port, like Cherbourg or Le Havre. Without a port, they could not unload the heavy equipment, the locomotives, the hundreds of thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition needed to sustain a modern army. The German strategy was simple: deny them the ports, contain their beachhead, and let their invasion force wither on the vine, starved of supplies. It was this assumption that the American and British industrial base rendered completely void. The Allies did not need to capture a port. They brought their own. Within days of the landing, the components of one of the most audacious engineering feats of the war began arriving off the coast of Arromanches. These were the Mulberry harbors. They were entire, prefabricated, temporary ports. They consisted of massive, hollow concrete caissons, some as large as a 6-story building, which were towed across the channel and then systematically flooded and sunk in a precise perimeter to create a breakwater. Inside this calm lagoon, a system of floating steel piers, codenamed Whale, was assembled, stretching from the shore to deep water. For the German reconnaissance pilots who flew over the coast and survived, The sight was demoralizing to the point of absurdity. An entire functioning harbor, capable of unloading thousands of tons per day, had simply appeared where there had been only open sea a week before. By June 19th, just 2 weeks after D-Day, these artificial ports had landed over 600,000 men, 100,000 vehicles, and mountains of supplies. At the same time, another invisible project was underway. Codenamed Pluto for pipelines under the ocean, it was a massive operation to lay flexible, armored fuel pipelines on the seabed of the English Channel. While German panzer divisions were being systematically immobilized by a lack of fuel, their movements dictated by the Luftwaffe's inability to protect their supply trucks, the Allied armies were being fed an inexhaustible, high-pressure stream of gasoline pumped directly from England. This was the avalanche. The battle for Normandy became a pure, brutal equation of industrial mathematics. A German panzer commander, after a hard day's fighting, would have to report the loss of 3 precious Panther tanks. His American counterpart, after losing 6 Shermans, would have 10 replacements delivered to his unit by morning. The German soldier was a finite resource. The Allied soldier was, for all strategic purposes, an infinite one. The German economist's worst fears had taken physical form. It was an overwhelming, crushing, unstoppable mass of steel, and it was now grinding its way mile by mile toward the heart of Germany. The final accounting began in the autumn of 1944. As the Allied armies, powered by the logistical miracle of the Red Ball Express and the Pluto pipelines, ground their way toward the German border, the Wehrmacht did not just begin to retreat, it began to disintegrate. This was not a rout. It was a methodical industrial disassembly. The war, which German economists had once seen as a series of short, victorious sprints, had become the exact marathon of attrition they had deemed impossible, and their nation's industrial heart was failing its final stress test. On the Western Front, the last German offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, was the final dying spasm of this failed doctrine. It was a brilliant plan on paper, a classic Blitzkrieg-style armored thrust through the Ardennes, designed to split the Allied armies and seize the crucial port of Antwerp. It was launched with the last strategic reserves of the Third Reich, including elite SS panzer divisions equipped with the formidable King Tiger tank. For a few terrifying days, it worked. The German spearheads, aided by fog and snow that grounded Allied air power, punched a deep salient into the American lines. But the offensive was not defeated by a brilliant countermaneuver. It was defeated by an empty fuel gauge. The entire plan was contingent on overrunning Allied fuel dumps, because the German tanks did not have enough gasoline to make it to Antwerp and back. When the fog lifted, the Allied industrial machine reasserted its dominance. Swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts, a single-engine fighter bomber that had been produced in the tens of thousands, descended on the German columns. They were not dogfighting, they were executing a hunt. They systematically destroyed the handful of precious, technologically superior German tanks, which were now stranded, immobile, and exposed on the snow-covered roads. The offensive froze, and then it shattered. Inside the Reich, Albert Speer's production miracle had finally met its end. The problem was no longer production targets. It was the physical impossibility of manufacturing. The Allied strategic bombing campaign, which had for years targeted cities in a controversial bid to break civilian morale, had shifted its focus with chilling precision. In 1944, it began a campaign to murder the German economy at its source. Bomber streams, escorted by the P-51 Mustangs that could fly all the way to Berlin and back, no longer had to fight for the skies. They owned them. They began to methodically strike the synthetic oil plants at Leuna and Ploiești. German fuel production, already strained, collapsed by over 90%. The revolutionary Me-262 jet fighters, which were now being produced in their hundreds, sat silently on their airfields. They were the most advanced aircraft in the world, rendered useless like iron statues for lack of kerosene. The Luftwaffe was grounded, not by a superior fighter, but by a superior logistical strategy. Next, the bombers targeted the transportation network. They shattered railroad marshalling yards, pulverized bridges, and destroyed the canal barges that moved the coal and iron ore. A German factory that had survived the bombing now sat idle. It had no electricity because the coal could not be delivered to its power plant. It had no steel because the iron ore could not be moved from the mine. The wonder weapons that were meant to save the Reich were choked in their cradles. In the final months of the war, German economists and planners were no longer managing a war economy. They were presiding over its autopsy. The final bitter irony was found in the very weapons they had created. The Panther tank, a machine that could kill a Sherman from 2 kilometers away, was now being dug into the earth on the outskirts of Berlin. It was a stationary pillbox. It had no fuel to move, no ammunition to fire, and no spare parts to fix its complex transmission. Across the Eastern Front, entire divisions, which still existed on Hitler's situation maps in the fantasy world of his bunker, were in reality just starving, freezing bands of men with rifles, their heavy equipment long since abandoned. The Nazi economists had looked at America and seen a decadent consumer society obsessed with cars, radios, and refrigerators. They had failed to understand that a nation capable of mass-producing millions of complex competing automobiles was a nation that had already mastered the precise skills needed for total war. It was the engineers from Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors who had applied the logic of the civilian assembly line to the tank and the bomber. It was the logistician from Sears or the A&P grocery chain who understood how to manage a supply chain vast enough to feed an army across an ocean. The soft American consumer, the Rosie the Riveter, who had built vacuum cleaners, was the same person who was now building B-29s with terrifying efficiency. The German belief in the power of will had been broken by the simple, brutal power of organization. Ideology had been defeated by logistics. The avalanche of steel that began in Detroit and Willow Run did not stop at the Rhine. It met another, equally vast avalanche that had begun in the factories of the Urals, an avalanche itself, critically aided by American Lend-Lease. The arsenal of democracy had done exactly what it promised. It armed the world, and, in doing so, crushed the industrial heart of the Third Reich. The war was a victory of soldiers and sailors, pilots and marines, but it was fundamentally a triumph of the logistician, the engineer, and the factory worker. It proved that the true measure of a nation's power was not its martial spirit or its ideological fervor, but its raw, organized, and relentless capacity to build. The American arsenal, once awakened, had delivered its final terrible accounting, proving that while battles may be won by valor, modern war is won by the factory, and that is why these tales must be told.